What if you discovered your boyfriend still isn't over his ex, not through texts, not through photos, not through some dramatic confession at 2 a.m., but through 47 handwritten pages filled with love, memory, and longing? I thought we were happy. I thought I was the one. Then I found his notebook, left open on the desk like an accident, like fate, like a door someone forgot to close. He had described how the other girl laughed. How she smelled. How she said his name, the exact syllables of it, like it was a sound he had spent years learning to love. He wrote about her for 47 pages. Me? I was mentioned exactly twice. Once as the new girl. This is the full story of the most painful discovery of my life, and how I found myself again after it shattered me into pieces I wasn't sure I could ever reassemble. If you've ever felt like second choice in a relationship, like a placeholder in someone else's unfinished story, this one will hit deep. Stay till the end. My name is Nora Bennett, and for 2 years, I thought I was falling in love with a man named Julian Cross. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, because he made sure of it, was that Julian had never actually finished falling out of love with someone else. And it took 47 handwritten pages, found by accident on an ordinary Tuesday evening, to show me the truth he had been too much of a coward to say out loud. I have never believed in fireworks. I've always been suspicious of love stories that arrive with thunder and lightning, the kind that burn hot and fast and leave scorch marks on everything they touch. I believed, instead, in quiet love, the kind that grows slowly, like ivy climbing a wall, patient and persistent, until one day you look up and realize it has covered the whole house. That's what I thought I had with Julian. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party 2.5 years ago, both of us standing awkwardly near the drinks table, both of us clearly hoping someone would rescue us from a conversation about cryptocurrency happening 3 feet away. He made a joke about the wine being aggressively mediocre, and I laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprises you a little, and something about the ease of that first exchange felt like the beginning of something worth paying attention to. Julian was a graphic designer, thoughtful in the particular way that quiet, observant men often are. He noticed things. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk after I'd mentioned it exactly once. He remembered the name of my childhood dog. He sent me songs he thought I'd like with little notes attached. This reminded me of you, and for a long time, I mistook his attentiveness for depth, his stillness for security. We moved in together after 1.5 years, into a small apartment with creaky floors and 2 little closet space, and I remember standing in the empty living room before we'd unpacked a single box, feeling something settle inside me, a kind of relief, a kind of finally. I had dated men who were loud and unpredictable, men who loved in bursts and disappeared in silences, and Julian felt like the opposite of all of that. He felt safe. He felt chosen, and choosing. I didn't know, then, that safety and honesty are not always the same thing. I didn't know that a person can be gentle with you and still be keeping an entire second heart hidden in a drawer. Her name was Camille. I knew that much, early on, the way you know the outline of a story without ever being told the details. Julian and Camille had dated for 4 years in their mid-20s, a relationship that had, by his account, simply run its course, ending amicably, without drama, the way relationships are supposed to end in the version of the story someone tells you when they don't want you asking follow-up questions. We just wanted different things, he told me once, early in our relationship, when I'd asked about the framed photo, since removed, that a mutual friend mentioned had once sat on his old bookshelf. It wasn't a big dramatic thing. We just grew apart. I believed him, because there was no reason not to. He never brought her up unprompted. He didn't follow her on social media, or at least not in any way I could see. When her name came up, rarely, and always by accident, some mutual acquaintance mentioning her at a party, his face would do something small and quick, a flicker I told myself was just the ordinary discomfort of an old chapter being reopened, nothing more. Looking back now, with the particular clarity that only comes after the floor has already caved in, I can see all the moments I should have paid closer attention to. The way he sometimes went quiet for an evening, offering no explanation, and I filled the silence with generous assumptions: he's tired, he's stressed about work, he just needs space. The way certain songs made him go somewhere else entirely, his eyes distant, his hand stilling on mine. The notebook he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he always closed quickly if I walked into the room while he was writing in it, the one I never once thought to ask about, because I trusted him, because I believed that love, quiet, patient, ivy-climbing love, meant I didn't need to check. I think, in hindsight, some part of me sensed there was a ghost in our apartment. I just didn't know her name was written on 47 pages, in his own handwriting, in a notebook I could have opened at any point in the last 18 months. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in early October, the kind of evening that gives you no warning at all about what it's about to do to you. I remember the small, unremarkable details with a clarity that almost feels cruel now: the smell of the pasta sauce I'd left simmering on the stove, the rain tapping lightly against the kitchen window, the particular gray light of early autumn dusk falling across our living room. Julian was out at a client dinner, one of those work obligations that ran long and left him apologetic over text. I was puttering around the apartment, restless in the particular way you'd get on a quiet evening alone, when I walked past his desk in the corner of our bedroom and noticed something out of place. The notebook, the same worn, leather-bound notebook I had seen 100 times before, always closed, always tucked away, was open. Left carelessly on the desk, as if he'd been called away mid-sentence and simply forgotten to close it. A pen lay across the page like a bookmark. I want to be honest here, I hesitated. There was a version of that moment where I could have walked past, respected the privacy of a notebook that wasn't mine to read, let the evening continue undisturbed. I think about that alternate version of the night sometimes, the one where I never looked down, where I simply closed the notebook without reading a word and went back to stirring the sauce, and Julian came home and we ate dinner and nothing changed. But I did look down. And the first line my eyes landed on was her name. Camille laughed with her whole body, like the joke had knocked something loose in her. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, one hand still resting on the doorframe. I don't know at what point I actually sat down at his desk, in his chair, and began to read, not skimming, not glancing, but reading, page after page, my heart beating a slow, sick rhythm against my ribs as the truth of what I was holding became undeniable. 47 pages. 47 pages of memory, written in a hand I recognized from grocery lists and birthday cards, now turned toward something entirely different, something tender, something aching, something that read, unmistakably, like love that had never actually finished. I read slowly, at first, my mind still trying to construct some innocent explanation, a creative writing exercise, an old journal he'd forgotten he still had, something, anything, that wouldn't mean what it was starting to mean. But the pages didn't allow for innocent explanations. They were dated. Recent. Some entries only weeks old. He wrote about the way Camille laughed, with her whole body, like the joke had knocked something loose in her, a description so specific, so clearly born of years of watching someone closely, that it made my stomach turn. He wrote about the way she smelled, some combination of vanilla and rain he described across 2 full paragraphs, as if the memory of her scent were a place he still visited in his mind on ordinary afternoons. He wrote about the particular way she said his name, not Julian the way everyone else said it, but some private inflection, some softened vowel that apparently existed only for her, that he described as the sound I still hear before I fall asleep. He wrote about their trip to the coast 4 years ago, a full 3 pages, dense with detail, the exact color of the sky at sunset, the exact words she'd said standing at the edge of the water. He wrote about an argument they'd had that had somehow, in his retelling, become tender, a memory of vulnerability rather than conflict, evidence, in his mind, of how deeply they had once known each other. He wrote, on one particularly devastating page, dated only 6 weeks earlier, "I don't know how to explain to anyone why I still think about her the way I do. It doesn't feel like missing someone. It feels like missing a version of myself that only existed when I was with her." I turned pages with hands that had gone strangely numb, searching, I'll admit it, searching almost frantically by that point, for some mention of me. Some evidence that I existed in this internal landscape he had been cultivating in secret for however long this notebook had lived in that drawer. I found myself exactly twice. Once, in a single sentence buried on page 31, the new girl asked about my week today. I gave her the easy version. The new girl. 18 months into our relationship, living together, sharing a bed, sharing a life, and in the private language of his own handwriting, I was still the new girl, a phrase that implied not just distance but temporariness, as if I were a placeholder, a chapter he hadn't yet decided was permanent. And once more, on the final written page, in a sentence that somehow hurt even more than the first, "Nora is good for me. I think. I hope that's the same as loving her. I think. I hope that's the same as loving her." I sat in his desk chair for a long time after that, the notebook open in my lap, the pasta sauce burning, unattended, on the stove behind me, filling the apartment with the smell of something scorched. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that the smell was appropriate. Something in that apartment was burning. It just wasn't dinner. I don't remember exactly how long I sat there before I heard his key in the lock. Time had gone strange and slippery, the way it does in moments of genuine shock, minutes stretching and collapsing without any reliable shape. I had closed the notebook by then, though I couldn't have told you why, some instinct toward composure, maybe, some desire not to hand him the satisfaction of finding me in tears with the evidence spread across my lap like a crime scene. I sat at the kitchen table instead, the notebook placed deliberately in the center of it, and waited. Julian came in cheerful, shaking rain off his coat, already talking about the dinner, about a client who'd been difficult, about traffic on the highway, and then he saw the notebook on the table, and I watched every trace of that cheerfulness drain out of his face in real time, like watching color leave a photograph. "Nora," he said, his voice suddenly careful, cautious, the voice of a man realizing, in a single terrible instant, exactly what kind of conversation he had just walked into. "What is that doing out here?" "You left it open," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, flat and quiet in a way that surprised even me. "On your desk. I wasn't looking for it. I just saw it." He didn't say anything for a long moment. He stood in the doorway, still in his damp coat, water pooling slightly on the floor beneath him, and I watched him search, visibly, painfully, for some explanation that might soften what I had already read. "How much did you read?" he finally asked. "All of it," I said. "All 47 pages. He closed his eyes briefly, and something in his shoulders sagged, the particular collapse of a person who has just watched a carefully maintained structure finally give way. "Nora, I can explain, can you?" I asked, and I heard my own voice crack slightly on the second word, the composure I'd been holding on to finally beginning to fray. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty simple." You've been writing love letters to your ex-girlfriend for however long, in a notebook you kept hidden from me, and I show up in it exactly twice, once as the new girl, and once as someone you hope you love, past tense implied, like you're still deciding. It's not like that, he said, but the protest came out weak, unconvincing, the words of a man defending a position he no longer fully believed himself. Then what is it like, Julian? I said. Because I'd really love to hear the version where this isn't exactly what it looks like. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, still in his wet coat, and for the next hour, he tried to explain something that, in the end, had no explanation that could make it hurt any less. He told me that writing had always been how he processed things, that he'd kept journals on and off since college, that the notebook wasn't really about wanting Camille back so much as it was about working through unresolved feelings from a relationship that had ended more messily than he'd ever admitted to me. He told me that Camille had actually ended things, not the mutual, amicable parting he'd always described, and that the sting of that rejection had apparently lived in him, quietly, for years, resurfacing in private pages he'd never intended anyone to read. I didn't think it meant anything, he said. I thought it was just processing. Getting it out of my system. 6 weeks ago, I said quietly. You wrote that entry about missing a version of yourself 6 weeks ago, Julian. We'd been living together for over a year. We talked about getting a dog. We talked about marriage. And 6 weeks ago, you were sitting somewhere writing about how she said your name. He didn't have an answer for that. Not really. He offered fragments. It doesn't mean I don't love you, it's complicated, feelings aren't always logical, I never acted on any of it, nothing ever actually happened, but none of it addressed the central, devastating fact sitting between us on that kitchen table, that for the entire span of our relationship, some significant part of his emotional life had been happening somewhere I wasn't invited, addressed to someone who wasn't me, in a language of longing he had never once used to describe his feelings for me. You called me the new girl, I said. In your own handwriting. Not to a friend as a joke. To yourself. In private. That's how you actually think of me, underneath everything else. That's not fair, he said. That was one line, one bad night, and the last page? I said. I think. I hope that's the same as loving her. Julian, do you understand what that sentence did to me? You've never once told me you loved me and meant it with certainty. You've been hoping it was true this whole time, and I had no idea I was dating someone's hope instead of someone's certainty. He didn't cry, which somehow made it worse. He sat there, pale and still, and I realized, watching him, that some part of him had known this reckoning was coming for a long time, that the notebook being left open that particular evening might not have been entirely an accident, might have been some subconscious cry for exactly this collision, because he hadn't found the courage to create it himself. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside a man I had believed, that morning, I understood completely, and I felt the entire architecture of the last 2.5 years quietly rearranging itself in my memory, every warm moment now shadowed by a question I couldn't unsee. Was this real, or was I simply the girl standing closest to him when he decided he needed someone to practice loving with? I thought about the small tender moments I had treasured, the songs he'd sent with little notes, the way he remembered my coffee order, the quiet Sunday mornings that had felt, at the time, like the architecture of a real and lasting life. I turned each memory over in my mind, searching them now for evidence of what I'd apparently missed, and found myself unable to trust even the good ones anymore. Had any of it been fully mine? Or had I simply been living in the margins of a story that was still, secretly, about someone else? Julian slept, or pretended to, his breathing slow and even beside me, while I stared at the ceiling and felt something in my chest slowly, methodically breaking, not with the sharp violence of a single blow, but with the grinding, accumulating weight of every small realization arriving one after another through the dark. He had let me build a life around him without ever telling me that part of him was still living somewhere else. He had let me say I love you into a space that, on some level, he'd never fully occupied. Around 4 in the morning, I got up, moved quietly into the living room, and sat with my knees pulled to my chest on the couch we had picked out together, in the apartment we had built together, and I let myself cry, not the composed, controlled tears of the kitchen table conversation, but the kind that comes from somewhere deeper, ugly and gasping and entirely without dignity, the kind of crying that belongs only to the truly alone hours of the night. I thought about my mother, who had once told me, years earlier, after my first serious heartbreak in college, "Nora, the worst kind of loneliness isn't being alone. It's being with someone and still being alone, because they never let you all the way in." I hadn't understood what she meant back then. I understood it completely now, sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning with 47 pages of someone else's longing still burned into my memory. I left 3 days later. It wasn't an impulsive decision, though I imagine, from the outside, it must have looked that way, the quick, dramatic exit of a woman who had discovered a devastating secret. But those 3 days were among the most carefully considered of my life. I spent them talking to my sister on the phone for hours at a time, walking alone through the park near our apartment in the cold October air, sitting with the question that mattered more than anger, more than hurt, more than the specific, aching betrayal of those 47 pages. Could I ever trust that I was fully chosen here, or would I always wonder what he was writing about in some notebook I couldn't see? Julian tried, in those 3 days, in his own limited and belated way, to fight for what we'd had. He deleted the digital copies of some of the writing he admitted existed elsewhere. He offered to go to therapy, individual and couples both. He told me, repeatedly, with what I believe was genuine anguish, that he loved me, that the notebook was old wounds resurfacing rather than a real desire to return to Camille, that he wanted to build a future with me and only me. I believed that some of what he said was true. I think he did love me, in whatever partial, complicated way he was capable of loving anyone while a piece of himself remained anchored somewhere in the past. But love that arrives partial, love that has to compete for space with an old, unfinished grief the person never had the courage to name out loud, that isn't the love I had signed up for. I hadn't agreed to be someone's rebound that lasted 2 years. I hadn't agreed to be the new girl in the private ledger of his own heart. I can't spend the rest of my life wondering if I'm the one you actually want, or just the one who happened to be standing here when you were ready to move on, I told him, the morning I packed the last of my boxes into my sister's car. And I don't think that's a question I should have to keep asking. Not after 2.5 years. Not ever, really, in a relationship that's supposed to be real. He didn't have an answer for that either. I think, by that point, he finally understood that there wasn't one that could fix what those 47 pages had already, irreversibly, revealed. Moving out was its own particular kind of grief, not just the grief of losing Julian, but the grief of losing an entire imagined future, the apartment with its creaky floors and cramped closets that I had, without fully realizing it, mentally furnished with years I hadn't lived yet. I had pictured us there for anniversaries, maybe eventually for the early exhausted months of a baby's first year, for the accumulated clutter and comfortable rhythms of an actual shared life. I stayed with my sister, Beth, for the first 6 weeks, sleeping on a pull-out couch in her spare room, surrounded by boxes I didn't have the energy to unpack. Beth was patient with me in a way I don't think I fully appreciated until much later. She never once said "I told you so," even though she had, in fact, expressed quiet reservations about Julian's stillness long before the notebook ever surfaced, reservations I had dismissed at the time as her simply not understanding the particular texture of quiet love. "You don't have to explain it to me," she said one night, when I finally tried, haltingly, to describe what those 47 pages had actually contained, the specific cruelty of being mentioned exactly twice, once as a stranger's placeholder title. "I just want you to know you're allowed to be furious. Not just sad. Furious." I hadn't fully given myself permission for fury yet, still moving mostly through a fog of grief and self-doubt, replaying the relationship on a loop, searching for the moment I should have known, the sign I should have caught. Beth's permission cracked something open in me, a slower burning anger underneath the sadness, one that took weeks to fully surface but that, once it did, felt like the beginning of something closer to healing than the tears ever had. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking obsessively about those 47 pages, not the content anymore, but the shape of what they revealed. I realized, slowly, that the notebook hadn't actually broken something that had been whole. It had simply shown me, in devastating and undeniable detail, something that had already been broken for a long time, a relationship where I had never actually been fully seen, fully chosen, fully present in the way I deserved to be. I thought about all the ways I had made myself smaller in that relationship without fully realizing it, softening my own opinions to match his quiet moods, filling his silences with generous interpretations rather than asking direct questions, mistaking his passivity for peace rather than recognizing it, correctly, as a kind of absence. I had built an entire relationship around the idea of quiet love, and somewhere along the way, I had let that idea excuse a distance that should have worried me far earlier than it did. I started seeing a therapist, a calm, sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Alvarez, who helped me untangle something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself, that the deepest wound of the notebook wasn't really about Camille at all. It was about discovering that I had spent 2.5 years loving someone fully, completely, without reservation, while he had been loving me, if that's even the right word, with one hand still holding on to someone else. The 47 pages weren't really the injury, Dr. Alvarez said to me once, in a session that reshaped how I thought about the entire relationship. They were just the proof. The injury happened slowly, over 2 years, every time you sensed distance and talked yourself out of naming it. The notebook just handed you undeniable evidence of something you'd already been quietly grieving without knowing it. That reframing changed something in me. I stopped thinking of myself purely as a victim of a single devastating discovery, and started understanding myself as someone who had, for a long time, been quietly overriding her own instincts in favor of a story she wanted to believe. It wasn't my fault, Julian's secrecy was his own choice, his own failure of honesty, but recognizing my own patterns gave me something the anger alone couldn't, a path forward that didn't depend on him ever fully understanding what he'd done. Healing, I learned, is rarely linear. There were weeks where I felt genuinely strong, capable, even grateful for the clarity the notebook had forced into my life. And there were nights, usually late, usually unexpected, triggered by something as small as a song on the radio or the particular quality of autumn light through a window, where the grief arrived all over again, fresh and raw, as if no time had passed at all. I found a small studio apartment of my own 3 months after leaving, a space with good light and creaky floors of its own, though this time the creaks belonged only to me. I painted the walls a soft, warm yellow, a color Julian had once called too cheerful, and I hung art I chose entirely on my own taste, without the quiet negotiation of 2 people compromising towards some shared middle ground that had, in hindsight, usually bent toward his preferences rather than mine. I started running again, something I'd let slide during the relationship, and found, on cold morning routes through the park, a kind of clarity I hadn't accessed in months, my body moving forward, literally, while my mind slowly caught up to the idea that forward motion was, in fact, possible. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted from, the way people sometimes do when a relationship becomes the primary architecture of their social life. My friend Priya, whom I'd known since college, took me out for what she called aggressively fun nights that helped remind me I was still, underneath the grief, someone capable of laughter that had nothing to do with anyone's approval but my own. Slowly, month by month, the sharp edges of the betrayal began to soften into something more like a scar than a wound, still visible, still part of my story, but no longer actively bleeding into every corner of my daily life. 6 months after I moved out, Julian texted me. I hadn't heard from him in weeks by that point, our contact having tapered into the practical logistics of splitting a shared bank account and forwarding mail, and I remember staring at his name on my phone screen for a long moment before opening the message. I'd been in therapy. I finally understand some things about myself I couldn't see before. I'm not asking you to come back. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry, really sorry, for what I put you through. You deserved so much better than being the new girl in your own relationship. I read the message several times, sitting on the small couch in my studio apartment, and I felt something complicated move through me, not the sharp, immediate pain of 6 months earlier, but something quieter, almost bittersweet. I believed him, in a way. I believed he had done real work, that the man who sent that message had grown, at least somewhat, from the man who had let me discover the truth in a notebook rather than telling me himself. But belief in his growth didn't translate into any desire to return. I had done my own work in those 6 months, work that had taught me something Julian's message, however sincere, couldn't undo, that I deserved a love that didn't require forensic discovery to understand its full shape. I deserved someone who told me the truth in real time, not someone who let me stumble onto it by accident on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I typed back a short reply, "Thank you for saying that. I'm glad you're doing the work. I wish you well, genuinely. But I don't think reaching back is the right thing for either of us." He didn't respond, and I didn't expect him to. Some doors, once you've walked through them fully, aren't meant to be walked back through, no matter how much growth happens on the other side. I used to believe, as I said at the beginning of this story, in quiet love, the slow, patient, ivy-climbing kind. I still believe in it, actually. But I've learned, in the aftermath of Julian and his 47 pages, that there's a crucial difference between quiet love and hidden love, a distinction I hadn't fully understood before. Quiet love is patient, but it isn't secretive. Quiet love takes its time, but it doesn't keep locked drawers. Quiet love can be still without being distant, gentle without being evasive. What Julian and I had wasn't quiet love, it was a love with an entire hidden room I was never invited into, a room where he kept processing feelings he never had the courage to name to my face. I've learned to recognize the difference now, in ways both large and small. I notice when someone's stillness feels like peace versus when it feels like withholding. I ask direct questions instead of filling silences with generous, hopeful assumptions. I pay attention when something in me flickers with unease, rather than talking myself back into comfortable ignorance the way I did, for so long, with the drawer I never thought to open. I've also learned something harder, something about my own worth that took much longer to fully absorb, that being someone's new girl, someone's placeholder, someone's hope that it's the same as loving her, that isn't a reflection of my value. It's a reflection of what Julian was capable of giving, at that particular moment in his own unfinished healing. My worth was never actually in question, even in the darkest weeks after the notebook, even when it felt, in the moment, like those 47 pages had rendered a verdict on how lovable I truly was. They hadn't. They had only revealed the truth about one particular man's unfinished heart. My own heart, whole and capable and deserving, remained entirely intact underneath the wreckage, waiting, patiently, for me to remember that. It's been just over a year now since that ordinary Tuesday evening, since the smell of scorched pasta sauce and the sight of my own name reduced to the new girl in someone else's handwriting. I'm sitting in my studio apartment as I write this, the yellow walls warm in the late afternoon light, a life around me that belongs entirely, unambiguously to me. I've dated a little in the past year, though nothing serious yet, and this time I've noticed myself paying closer attention to the small signals I once talked myself out of noticing. I ask more direct questions earlier. I pay attention to how present someone actually is, rather than how comfortable their stillness feels. I've learned that vigilance, exercised with care rather than paranoia, is simply a form of self-respect I hadn't fully practiced before. I've also, somewhat unexpectedly, started keeping a notebook of my own, not hidden in any drawer, not secret from anyone, but simply a place where I write down the things I'm learning about myself as I rebuild. There's something quietly reclaiming about that, about taking the very object that once broke my heart and turning it into something that helps put me back together instead. My sister Beth still checks in regularly, and Priya still drags me out for aggressively fun nights whenever she senses I've been staying in too much. My mother, when I finally told her the full story months after it happened, held my hand across her kitchen table and said, simply, "I'm proud of you for leaving." That takes more strength than most people ever have to find. I think about Julian sometimes, not with the sharp ache of that first devastating week, but with a kind of distant, almost gentle curiosity. I hope he's found whatever peace he was searching for in those 47 pages, whatever unfinished business with Camille he needed to fully close before he could be honest, fully and completely, with anyone else. I hope, for his sake and for whoever comes after me, that he learned to write his truths out loud instead of only in private. But that hope doesn't come with any wish to return. I built this life, this apartment, this version of myself, on the foundation of a truth I discovered by accident and then chose, deliberately, to fully honor. And that foundation feels, a year later, entirely solid beneath my feet. Some evenings, when the light comes through my windows just right, I catch myself thinking about the version of me who sat frozen at that kitchen table a year ago, waiting for Julian's key in the lock, the notebook placed deliberately in the center of the table like evidence in a trial only I had convened. I wish I could reach back through time and tell her something, not that it would stop hurting, because it did, and it should have, and there's no shortcut around grief that size. But I wish I could tell her that the hurt was proof of how fully she had loved, not proof of how foolish she had been. I wish I could tell her that leaving would feel, eventually, less like losing everything and more like finally being handed back the parts of herself she hadn't realized she'd been quietly setting aside for 2.5 years. She couldn't have heard it then. But I hope, in some small way, writing it all down now means someone else, standing exactly where she once stood, might. There's a part of this story I haven't told yet, one I only fully understood months later, sitting across from Priya at our regular Thursday dinner, when she finally admitted something she'd been carrying since long before the notebook ever surfaced. "I almost said something to you, once," she told me, turning her wine glass slowly by its stem, not quite meeting my eyes. "About 8 months before you found it. We were at that birthday party, remember, the one at the rooftop bar? Julian left early to take a work call, and you spent 20 minutes explaining to me why that wasn't strange, why it made sense, why I shouldn't read into it." I remembered the party. I remembered, too, with a fresh wince of recognition, exactly how thoroughly I had explained it, building an elaborate, generous case for his absence before Priya had even finished raising an eyebrow. I noticed you did that a lot, she continued gently, explaining him before anyone had even questioned him. I used to wonder if you were trying to convince me, or trying to convince yourself. I sat with that for a long moment, the restaurant noise fading around us. She was right, of course. I could see it now with the particular clarity that comes only in hindsight, the way I had built an entire private legal practice around defending Julian's small absences and silences, presenting evidence for his innocence before anyone had even filed a complaint. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, not with accusation, just genuine curiosity. Because you seemed happy, she said simply. Or you seemed like you'd convinced yourself you were happy, which from the outside looks almost the same. And I didn't want to be the friend who plants a seed of doubt in someone else's relationship based on a feeling I couldn't fully prove. I've regretted that a little, honestly. I keep wondering if a small nudge earlier might have saved you some of the pain. It wouldn't have, I told her, and I meant it, having turned this exact question over many times in therapy. I wasn't ready to hear it then. I needed the 47 pages. I needed something undeniable, because anything smaller, I would have argued my way around, the same way I argued my way around that rooftop bar. Priya reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I felt, in that small gesture, the particular comfort of being known by someone who had watched the whole slow unraveling from the outside and loved me through it anyway, even when she hadn't known exactly how to help. I think about that conversation often now, especially when I meet someone new and feel the old instinct rising in me, the urge to build a generous, elaborate defense for behavior that, in a healthier relationship, wouldn't require defending at all. I've learned to notice that instinct now, to pause before I explain someone else's silence away, and to ask myself, honestly, whether I'm defending them because the truth is genuinely mundane, or because some part of me is once again trying to convince myself of a story I'm not fully sure I believe. It's a small, quiet practice, but it's one of the most important tools this entire experience left me with, the simple discipline of listening to my own doubt instead of immediately, reflexively arguing against it on someone else's behalf. Almost a year after I moved out, I saw Camille for the first time, not intentionally, not through any effort of my own, but by pure, strange coincidence, standing 3 people ahead of me in line at a coffee shop near my new apartment, in a part of the city I hadn't previously associated with Julian's old life at all. I recognized her immediately, though I had never actually met her, never even seen a photograph, some instinct, some accumulated detail from those 47 pages, assembling itself instantly into recognition the moment I heard her order her coffee and say her name to the barista for the pickup ticket. She looked entirely ordinary. Kind, unremarkable, tired in the specific way of someone juggling a demanding week, laughing at something the barista said with a warmth that didn't, in that mundane moment, look anything like the mythic figure who had lived in my head for months. I didn't approach her. There was nothing to say, nothing that would have served either of us, and some clear-eyed part of me recognized immediately that whatever had happened between her and Julian, whatever unfinished business he'd been quietly nursing in that notebook, had very little to do with who she actually was as a person standing in line for an oat milk latte on an ordinary Thursday morning. She hadn't asked to be turned into 47 pages of longing. She hadn't asked to become the ghost haunting someone else's relationship. In her own way, she was as unknowing a participant in my heartbreak as I had once been an unknowing participant in Julian's unfinished grief. I left the coffee shop before my order was even called, walked 2 blocks in the cold, and sat on a park bench for a long time, turning the encounter over in my mind. I had expected, if I ever saw her, to feel something enormous, rage, maybe, or grief, or some complicated mixture of both. What I actually felt was smaller and stranger, a kind of quiet, almost peaceful clarity. She was just a person. The story Julian had built around her, in private, across 47 pages, had made her into something larger than life, a permanent unfinished ache. But standing in that ordinary coffee shop line, she had just been a woman getting her coffee, entirely unaware that she had ever been the center of anyone's careful, secret mythology. It helped, oddly, to see that. It helped to understand that the wound Julian carried had less to do with Camille as a real, present person, and everything to do with his own unfinished relationship with loss, something he would have to resolve within himself, regardless of who else came in or out of his life. That wasn't my burden to carry any longer. It never really had been. I mentioned that I started keeping a notebook of my own in the months after leaving, but I want to tell you more about what actually goes into it, because I think it says something important about what healing from this kind of betrayal can actually look like. At first, the entries were raw and unfiltered, pages of grief, pages of anger, pages where I simply transcribed, word for word, the sentences from Julian's notebook that had cut the deepest, as if writing them down myself might drain some of their power over me. The new girl. I think. I hope that's the same as loving her. I wrote them out again and again in the early weeks, a strange ritual of confrontation, until eventually the words stopped landing like blows and started reading, simply, as information, sad, but no longer capable of knocking the breath out of me. Slowly, the entries changed shape. I started writing down small observations about my own life that had nothing to do with Julian at all, the particular quality of light in my new apartment in the late afternoon, a conversation with a stranger on the subway that had made me laugh out loud, the specific pride of finishing a 10K run I hadn't trained properly for and completing anyway through sheer stubbornness. I started, without quite realizing I was doing it, building a record of a life that was entirely, unambiguously mine, proof, page by page, that I existed fully outside of anyone else's private mythology. Around the 6-month mark, I wrote an entry that I still return to sometimes. On the harder days, I used to think love meant being patient enough to wait for someone else's whole heart to arrive. I don't think that anymore. I think love means two people showing up complete, or at least honestly incomplete, and building something together instead of one person quietly finishing their grief in a locked drawer while the other one waits outside it, mistaking the waiting for intimacy. I don't know if I'll ever fully stop being someone who notices, a little too keenly, the difference between stillness and distance. Maybe that vigilance is simply part of what this experience left behind in me, a scar that also functions, usefully, as a kind of early warning system. But I've decided to think of it not as damage, but as a form of hard-won wisdom, the kind you can only really earn by surviving the specific, particular pain of 47 pages, and choosing, deliberately, to build something better on the other side of them. There's one more piece of this story I have to tell you, because it took me the longest to fully understand, and because I think it might be the most useful part for anyone reading this who is still standing where I once stood, in the wreckage, asking themselves the same impossible question I asked myself for months. The question was this: was any of it real? I asked it constantly in the early weeks. Lying awake beside a man who was, technically, still sleeping next to me those first 3 days. Sitting in Beth's spare room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. Sitting across from Dr. Alvarez, week after week, circling the same wound from slightly different angles. Was the way Julian had looked at me across the dinner table on ordinary Tuesday nights real, or had I simply been watching a performance of contentment layered over something hollow? Were the songs he'd sent with little notes, "This reminded me of you," genuine, or were they simply the actions of a man going through the motions he believed a good partner should perform, while the real, unguarded parts of his attention stayed locked in a drawer? For a long time, I couldn't answer that question, and the not knowing felt like its own separate wound, layered on top of the original one. If none of it had been real, then I had spent 2.5 years loving a fiction, grieving a person who had never actually existed the way I believed him to. If all of it had been real, if he really had loved me, in whatever partial, complicated way, then the betrayal felt somehow crueler, because it meant he had chosen, again and again, not to tell me the truth even while genuinely caring for me. It was Dr. Alvarez, eventually, who offered me a reframing that finally let me set the question down. "Why does it have to be one or the other?" she asked me, during a session in early spring, months after I'd moved into my own apartment. "Why can't both things be true? He can have loved you, in a real, if incomplete, way. And he can have also been unable, for reasons that are entirely about his own unresolved history, to give you the fullness of that love without reservation. Neither of those facts cancels the other one out. And neither of them requires you to keep questioning your own worth." I sat with that for a long time after the session ended, walking home through a light spring rain that felt, in its own quiet way, like something being washed clean. I realized that I had been asking the wrong question all along. It was never really about whether Julian's love had been real or fake, whole or hollow. The question that actually mattered, the one that determined what I did next with my own life, was simpler and more within my control. Did I get to have the kind of love I deserved, in that relationship? The answer to that question was no. Regardless of what was happening in Julian's heart, regardless of whether his feelings for me were genuine or partial or somewhere confused in between, the plain fact remained that I had not received the fullness, the honesty, the undivided presence that real, sustainable love requires. That truth didn't depend on solving the unsolvable mystery of what he'd actually felt. It only depended on what I had actually received, and what I had actually received, in the end, was a love with an entire hidden room I was never once invited into. That distinction, small as it might sound, changed everything for me. It let me stop relitigating the entire relationship in my head, searching backward for some verdict on its authenticity. It let me simply accept what I already knew to be true, that I deserved better than what I'd had, regardless of Julian's internal experience of it, regardless of whether he'd meant well or simply meant poorly. My worth was never actually on trial in that question. Only the relationship's adequacy was, and it hadn't been adequate. It never really had been. I think that's the piece of wisdom I most want to pass along to anyone reading this who is still stuck asking themselves whether their own painful discovery meant their relationship was entirely fake, entirely a lie, entirely worthless in retrospect. You don't have to solve that question to move forward. You only have to know, clearly and without apology, what you actually deserved, and to trust yourself enough to go looking for it elsewhere, in someone capable of giving it to you without reservation, without a locked drawer, without 47 secret pages standing between you and the whole truth of their heart. If you're reading this, and you recognize yourself in my story, in the notebook you found, the phone you shouldn't have looked at, the sinking feeling of discovering that someone's stillness wasn't peace but distance, I want you to know something. Being mentioned twice, being called the new girl, being someone's hope rather than someone's certainty, none of that is a verdict on your worth. It's only ever a reflection of what the other person was capable of offering in that particular moment of their own unfinished story. You are not a placeholder. You are not a chapter someone is still deciding whether to keep. You deserve a love that doesn't require you to discover the truth by accident, a love that tells you, in real time, in its own voice, exactly how it feels. If you find your own version of those 47 pages, whatever form they take in your life, trust what they show you, even when it's devastating, even when part of you desperately wants to explain it away. The truth, however painful, is always more bearable in the long run than the slow erosion of pretending you didn't see it. You are not too much to be loved fully. You are not required to accept partial love simply because leaving feels harder than staying. The person who is truly ready for you will never make you feel like the new girl in your own relationship. I found that out the hard way. It cost me 2.5 years, 47 pages of someone else's unfinished heart, and a version of myself I had to slowly, deliberately build back from the ground up. But I would still choose the truth over the comfortable, well-lit lie every single time, because only the truth ever actually let me heal. I hope you find it out more gently than I did. And if you're standing right now in that first raw, disorienting week, still smelling the scorched pasta sauce, still hearing your own name reduced to a stranger's title in someone else's handwriting, I want you to know that the fog does lift, even when it feels permanent. The nights that seem endless do end. The questions that seem unanswerable do, eventually, resolve into something you can live with, even if the answer isn't the tidy one you were hoping for. You will not always feel this specific, sharp shape of grief. It softens. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. And on the other side of it, I promise, there is a version of your life that belongs entirely, unambiguously to you. No hidden drawers, no locked notebooks, no 47 pages standing quietly between you and the whole truth of anyone's heart. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, never let anyone dim your light. See you in the next one.